After 5.5 decades, the visionary ideas of the Taika reforms are at last made a reality. But right from the jump, cracks in the foundations are beginning to show. Join me today as we visit a new capital, meet new rulers, and witness the rise of new puppet masters pulling the strings behind it all on this 6th episode of Japanese History, the Textbook, on the Buyuden Japanese History channel. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Japanese History, the Textbook, the video series where we make our way chronologically through Japanese history, using Japanese language educational materials as our guide. I have two very little announcements before we begin today. Number one is that I've added yet another book to our stable of sources, this one being called Nihonshi Naze to Nagare ga Wakaru Hon. This book is aimed at Japanese high school students studying for college exams, and its cover proclaims that it's comprehensive enough to get you through the Japanese Center exam and into universities up to and including those of well-known status. However, it stops short of elite schools such as Tokyo and Kyoto University, so for all those viewers out there hoping my videos will get them into Tōdai, I'm afraid you may need to do some additional research. Anyway, this book has a strong focus on chronologically explaining the events and specific important people popping up throughout Japanese history, which is a bit in contrast to my other sources, which tend to focus more on larger themes and broader socio-historical developments. So that's why I've brought it on board. My second announcement is just a small correction to something I said in my very first video, which has been bugging me for weeks now. In that video, I translated the name for ancient Japanese dwellings, Tateana-jūkyō, into English as post-in-ground pit dwellings, but I should have just said pit dwellings or pit houses. They did have posts inside them supporting their roofs, but these really have nothing to do with their basic definition or with the meaning conveyed by the original Japanese word. I doubt this is really bothering anyone other than me, but I just wanted to get that correction out there. Alright, I think I've talked quite enough for this intro. Without further ado, let's get into the episode. Japanese History, the Textbook, Episode 6, The Nara Period, Part 1. At the end of our last video, Prince Ōama, younger brother of the architect of the Taika reforms, the late Emperor Tenji, defeated his own nephew, Tenji's son, in the Jinshin War to become the new leader of Japan. Ōama ascended to the throne in Asuka, where he took on the name Emperor Tenmu and became the first ruler in Japanese history to adopt the title of Tenno, Emperor of Japan. After Tenmu's death in 686, his widow took his place on the imperial throne as Empress Jito, and she set about carrying on her late husband's legacy, governing along the same trajectory that he had, and completing projects which he had begun, such as the move to the new capital at Fujiwara-kyo. She enacted her own new law code, the Asuka Kiyomihara-ryō, named after the imperial palace used prior to the move to Fujiwara-kyo. And she also conducted the Koin Ninjaku census. Following this, the conducting of censuses would become a regular thing, with a census being carried out once every 6 years, and each census being made obsolete 30 years after its creation. The only exception to this last rule would be the Koin Ninjaku itself, which would remain permanently as a sort of master list. Social class was a very important element of society at the time, and the Koin Ninjaku would exist as a means to confirm any person's lineage and the original social class of their ancestors. Ironically, this permanent master list has not survived to the present day. In 694, construction was completed on Fujiwara-kyo, and the imperial palace was officially moved there from Asuka. The goal in the creation of this new capital was to have a permanent place for emperors and empresses to conduct the affairs of government, without having to relocate every time a new person ascended to the throne. This may sound like the obvious choice, but this had not been the norm up until this point. Important bureaucratic offices and aristocratic residences were also placed in Fujiwara-kyo, and 3 emperors would ultimately reign from this capital: Empress Jito, her grandson Emperor Monmu, and Monmu's mother, Empress Genmei, who would move the capital again, this time to Heijō-kyō, aka Nara, partway through her reign. We are getting slightly ahead of ourselves though. This is the era when direct male line imperial succession was becoming the norm, and it is thought that Empress Jito may have ascended to the throne as a placeholder until her grandson, the later Monmu, was of age to rule. In later eras, we frequently see child emperors ascending to the chrysanthemum throne as figurehead rulers, but this was still very much an age when the sovereign was expected to be something of a competent adult, regardless of whether or not they were the one making the final political decisions. Monmu became emperor in 697 at the age of 14, adult enough for the time, I suppose, although the retired Empress Jito continued to help him govern until her death a few years later. Speaking of Empress Jito's death, she was actually the first emperor of Japan to be cremated after passing away. Easily the most important development of the young Emperor Monmu's reign was the establishment in 701 of the Taihō ritsuryō code, Japan's first of such to be created. The concept of a ritsuryō code was, like so many other things, an idea borrowed from the Chinese, in this case the Tang dynasty. The ritsu part refers to criminal law, punishments essentially, and the ryō part refers to administrative law, the rules, systems, and structures of government, in other words. The crux of this ritsuryō concept was that these criminal and administrative laws would be written down and compiled in an organized way, allowing for a powerful, structured central government with the emperor at its head. With the ritsuryō system in place, the emperor could feel confident that his orders were being transmitted to the right places and being carried out accordingly. Prior to 701's Heijō ritsuryō code, Emperor Tenji's Ōmi-ryō and Empress Jito's Asuka Kiyomihara-ryō had both been enacted, but these were both ryō-only law codes. The Heijō ritsuryō code was Japan's first complete, full-fledged adoption of the ritsuryō concept, incorporating both the criminal and administrative aspects of the system. The actual creation of this code was not carried out by Emperor Mommu himself, of course, but rather by two high-status political figures working under him, Fujiwara no Fuhito and Prince Osakabe. Fujiwara no Fuhito was the son of our old pal Nakatomi no Kamatari, the man who helped engineer the downfall of the Soga and plan the Taika reforms with Prince Naka no Oe, aka Emperor Tenji. And Prince Osakabe was the son of Emperor Tenmu. Now, you might be wondering, if Emperor Tenmu's son is alive and well, why is he not emperor instead of this teenage kid, Mommu? Well, up until relatively modern times, polygamy was practiced in Japan amongst people of high birth as a way of ensuring that children, particularly a son, would be born to carry on the family line. A nobleman would typically have multiple side wives called sokushitsu and a single main wife, his seishitsu. These words, by the way, are often translated into English as concubine and wife, respectively, but I personally find the terms sidewife and main wife to get the point across a bit more clearly and without the prostitute-invoking connotations of the word concubine. I will leave it up to you to choose the term you prefer. In the case of the emperor, he had a variety of different hierarchical categories of sidewife, but he also had only one main wife, the empress consort or kogo, and any sons born to her would be prioritized over all others. In the case of Emperor Tenmu, his main wife, the later Empress Jito, did indeed bear him a son, who became his crown prince. This prince would die in his 20s without ever managing to claim his birthright to the throne, but he did father a son during his lifetime, and that son was Emperor Mommu. In this way, Mommu, being the grandson of the main line, had priority over the sons of the various sidelines, such as the one that produced Prince Osakabe. Anyway, keep this seishitsu sokushitsu marriage system in the back of your mind from now on, as it'll be a constant thing we encounter throughout Japanese history, both with the aristocracy and with the samurai. Anyway, backtracking slightly to the Heijō ritsuryō code. We know that this code was made up of laws relating both to crime and punishment and to the administration of the country, but what was the actual content of these laws? Well, to put it simply, the Heijō ritsuryō code was the law code which actually implemented the ideas of the Taika reforms, the ideas outlined in the imperial reform decree issued in 645. The government, under the emperor, was fundamentally structured into a system of 2 high offices and 8 ministries, with the various gozoku lords and imperial relatives incorporated into said system as bureaucrats, receiving ranks from the emperor and being hereafter referred to as kizoku, aristocrats. The 2 high offices, by the way, were the Jingikan, the Department of Divinities, and the Daijōkan, the Great Council of State, with the former overseeing religious events and ceremonies, and the latter being in charge of governing under the leadership of the Minister of the Right, Udaijin, the Minister of the Left, Sadaijin, and the Chancellor of the Realm, the Daijō-daijin. Japan itself was divided into one central region, the Kinki or Kinai region, which we have discussed before, and 7 outer regions, each composed of multiple provinces. These outer regions, moving southwest to northeast, were the Saikaido, the Nankaido, the Sanyōdo, the Sangindo, the Tōkaido, the Hokurikudo, and the Tōsando. The provinces within these regions would each be led by a provincial governor called a kokushi, who would be dispatched from among the central aristocracy, and he would in turn have district managers called gunji serving under him, who were typically drawn from the wealthy layer of the local population. Highways were also built, connecting the various provincial capitals to the central region, and post stations were constructed along these roads at approximately 16-kilometer intervals, with horses called ekiba that could be swapped out from station to station to enable continuous riding. All free denizens of the realm, from aristocrats down to ordinary farmers, were called ryōmin, literally good people if you directly translate the kanji characters. But there was another class of people established beneath the ryōmin, who were called senmin. 5 varieties of senmin existed, but they were essentially a slave-like class of people, and the members of their lowest ranks were bought and sold like livestock. While the senmin certainly lived a blighted existence, they were at the very least free from the burden of many of the taxes which all ryōmin were obligated to pay. The tax system enforced upon the ryōmin was the Soyōchō system, which we touched on during our discussion of the Taika reforms. As I mentioned then, all people in Japan above the age of 6 were given rice fields called kubunden under the ritsuryō system of government, with males receiving about 2,300 square meters of land, females receiving 2/3 of this, and the individuals of the slave class receiving 1/3 of this portion. Free women and the slave class, however, only had to pay the government a certain amount of their rice crop, while free men had to pay not only a portion of the rice they grew, but also taxes in specialty local products, cloth, and manual labor performed for 60 days per year under the supervision of the provincial governor. They also were expected to transport the specialty products and cloth to the capital themselves. Finally, adult males were also subjected to a military draft for guard duty, either in Kyushu around the Dazaifu to guard against any possible attacks from the Asian mainland, or in the imperial capital. Once drafted for guard duty, one's term of service was 3 years, and while some of the Soyō-kyō taxes were exempted during this period, draftees were typically forced to foot their own bill for things such as their equipment and their travel expenses. Because of these various factors, there actually seems to have been a fair amount of census fraud among the peasant class, with many men registering as women to avoid paying the heavy taxes and carrying out the extreme obligations imposed on them. It's also worth noting that despite technically being ryomin, most high-level aristocrats were exempted from the military service and various taxes which I just outlined, mostly just paying the rice tax, for now at least. A waka poem remains from the early Nara period, written by a bureaucrat named Yamanoue no Okura, from the perspective of a poor farmer in his province, which vividly illustrates the plight of the ryomin peasants in the early 700s. An excerpt from Donald Keene's translation of the poem reads, "Wide as they call the heaven and earth, for me they have shrunk quite small. Bright though they call the sun and moon, they never shine for me. Is it the same with all men, or for me alone? By rare chance I was born a man, and no meaner than my fellows, but wearing unwadded sleeveless clothes in tatters, like weeds waving in the sea, hanging from my shoulders, and under the sunken roof with the leaning walls, here I lie on straw spread on bare earth, with my parents at my pillow, my wife and children at my feet, all huddled in grief and tears. No fire sends up smoke at the cooking place, and in the cauldron a spider spins its web. The village headman comes with rod in hand to our sleeping place, growling for his dues. Must it be so hopeless, the way of this world?" One can only imagine that it must have been hard for the young Emperor Mommu in his palace in Fujiwara-kyo to wrap his mind around the plight of the peasant class if he was aware of it at all. But sadly for him, he was destined to experience the harshness of life in the ancient world in his own way. 6 years after the enactment of the Taihō ritsuryō code in the year 707, the 25-year-old emperor fell ill and died, and his mother was forced to succeed him as sovereign, being enthroned as Empress Gemmei. Mommu did have a son at this time, but the boy was only 6 years old, and as mentioned before, Japanese royals of this period were not eager to put small children on the throne. As a result, Empress Gemmei, as well as the successor who followed her, would sit on the throne as stopgap rulers, holding down the fort until Mommu's son was of age to rule. The real power behind the throne at this time was the aforementioned Fujiwara no Fushito, whose daughter Miyako had been the late Emperor Mommu's sole wife and the mother to his young heir. Fushito was determined to see this child, his grandson, sit on the imperial throne one day. 708, the second year of Empress Gemmei's reign, saw the creation of the Wado Kaichin, Japan's first standardized circulated currency, and the first in a series of 12 official coinages released throughout Japan's ancient period. The Wado Kaichin contained 2 varieties of coins, copper and silver, and is thought to have been produced following a large tribute offering of copper to the imperial court from the province of Musashi. In ancient times, just as in modern ones, the issuing of currency was the sole right of the person or persons in charge of a country, and by creating the Wado Kaichin, the imperial court could thus further assert its status as the ultimate authority in Japan. Unfortunately for the court, however, this currency did not circulate particularly successfully. They had created it not with the needs of the people in mind, but rather with their own goals placed first and foremost, and the common people were quite happy to continue using rice and cloth as currency, just as they had been doing for ages. The government would actually go so far as to issue a law bestowing higher court ranks on individuals who accumulated large amounts of the Wado Kaichin coinage, a slightly confusing law considering that accumulation does not equal circulation, but it is likely that the court just wanted to get the coins out of their warehouses at this point. By the way, coins dating back to the late 600s were discovered in Asuka in 1998, casting some doubt on the Wado Kaichin's status as the first coin currency in Japanese history, but it is thought that these were likely just used for ritualistic purposes and did not circulate. Alright, so everything we have discussed up to this point has been something of a prologue to the Nara period, but it was all, technically speaking, still the tail end of the Asuka period. That's all about to change though, as in 710, Empress Gemmei moved the capital from Fujiwara-kyo to a new city called Heijō-kyō, modern-day Nara. One possible reason for this move may have been Fujiwara no Fushito's desire to get the seat of government away from meddling local power holders in the Asuka region. Like Fujiwara-kyo, the new capital of Heijō-kyo was built according to the Chinese grid style known as Tōjō in Japanese, but in Heijō-kyo's case, its layout was directly modeled on the Tang capital of Chang'an. A large boulevard called the Suzaku-Oji, or Suzaku Avenue, ran through the center of the city, dividing it into an eastern half called the Sakyo, or left capital, and a western half called the Ukyo, or right capital, with right and left being judged from the perspective of the imperial palace. Said palace, the Kyūjō, was in the central northern part of the city, and it consisted of the emperor's living space, known as the Dairi, 2 compounds for conducting the affairs of state, known as Chōdōin, a building for ceremonies involving the participation of the emperor, called the Daigokuden, and offices for the various administrative agencies of the government. At its southern end was a giant gate called the Suzaku-mon, a magnificent and imposing structure where foreign emissaries could be greeted. The palace complex was designed to be a self-contained unit within which all matters of government could be conducted. Heijō-kyō was also home to the residences of Japan's aristocrats and bureaucrats, and many important temples theretofore located in Asuka, such as Yakushiji, which we mentioned at the end of our last episode, were relocated to the new capital and rebuilt there. At its height, the city of Heijō-kyō was home to about 100,000 residents, roughly 2.2% of the entire population of Japan. Of these residents, some 7 to 10,000 were bureaucrats, but true blue-blooded aristocrats numbered only about 1 to 200. In 715, Empress Genmei retired from the throne, citing age as her reason. She was about 54 at the time, relatively old by ancient standards, and would indeed pass away only 6 years later. However, given that her grandson was still very young, she was instead succeeded by her daughter, the late Emperor Monmu's sister, who ascended to the throne as Empress Gensho. It was during the reigns of Genmei and her successor Gensho that Japan's 2 earliest surviving histories, the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, were finally completed. The composition of the former, the Kojiki, was begun in the late 600s by the order of Emperor Tenmu, but it was completed in 712 by a bureaucrat named Ono Yasumaro, who presented it to Empress Genmei. The Kojiki heavily focuses on the mythology behind Japan's imperial family, with about a third of it being prehistoric myth, describing, among many other things, how the gods Izanami and Izanagi created the Japanese archipelago, and how the grandson of the sun goddess Amaterasu eventually descended from heaven to rule it as the first emperor of Japan. The Kojiki was written in what was basically Japanese, though expressed only through Chinese kanji characters, and it seems to have been aimed at a domestic audience, with the goal of stressing the divine blood of the imperial family. The second history, our old friend the Nihon Shoki, was completed in 720 by the late Emperor Tenmu's son Prince Toneri Shinno, with a foreign audience in mind, being written in what was essentially Chinese. The Nihon Shoki covers up until the reign of Empress Jito, and while it also contains Japan's creation legend, only about 1/10 of its total content is in the realm of mythology. That being said, a large amount of the quote-unquote history in the 2 documents is highly dubious, and a large part of modern Japanese history scholarship has involved comparing them with the results of scientific and archaeological research to determine which parts are actually telling us the truth. Interestingly, up until World War II, both books were considered to be the canon history of Japan by the Japanese government, and it was only after the war that the country's creation myth stopped being taught as history in public school classrooms. During the reign of Empress Genmei's successor, Empress Gensho, Fujiwara no Fushito continued to operate as the puppet master behind the throne, and in 718 he enacted Japan's second ritsuryō law code, the Yōrō Ritsuryō. Although the former code, the Taihō Ritsuryō, does not exist today, it seems that Fushito's Yōrō Ritsuryō was nearly identical to its predecessor. His motivation for making the new code seems to have been that, while he participated in the creation of the previous code, the most central figure in its inception was the aforementioned Prince Okabe, and Fushito wanted a new code for which he could take primary credit. Fushito would pass away only 2 years later, and one can't help but wonder if his ambition here was driven by some sense that his life was nearing its close. Only about 1/3 of the Ritsu portion of the Yōrō Ritsuryō has survived until the present day, but nearly all of the Ryo portion is known to modern historians, in large part thanks to explanatory commentaries on it written during the Heian period. By the end of his life, Fujiwara no Fushito held and exercised power nearly at a dictatorial level, and so it is perhaps unsurprising that he had many detractors who were quite excited when he drew his final breath. After his death, those detractors rallied around one Prince Nagaya-o, a grandson of Emperor Tenmu through one of his lower-ranking wives, and Nagaya would step in to fill the power vacuum and become the new de facto leader of the government in Fushito's wake. Prince Nagaya focused his attentions in particular on the problems plaguing the imperial court's finances, problems brought on by the extreme harshness of the new ritsuryō tax system. I mentioned the male-to-female census fraud problem a little ways back, but even worse than fraud was the growing phenomenon of peasants outright discarding their kubunden rice fields and simply absconding. Many of these runaways became monks or vagrants, or entered into the personal service of wealthy aristocrats or large religious establishments, and their abandoned rice fields became uncultivated wasteland. Additionally, significant economic inequality had also begun to emerge among the peasant farming class, with unscrupulous individuals illegally buying up or confiscating other people's kubunden land and treating it as their own property, despite the fact that it technically belonged to the state. These factors, along with a fair amount of population growth throughout the country, meant that there was actually an insufficiency of kubunden fields. Prince Nagaya resolved that the ideal solution to the government's financial problems was not any sort of humanitarian policy change, but rather a simple increase in the number of rice fields being cultivated, as more land being farmed equals more land being taxed. In 722, he issued a new land development plan called the Hyakuman Chobu Kaikon Keikaku, and under this plan, provincial governors or district managers would provide peasants with food and set them to work opening up new land for cultivation for periods of 10 days at a time. Governors or managers who failed to do so effectively could face penalties as harsh as having their posts permanently revoked without any chance of reinstatement. However, even despite the central government's bullying demeanor, this campaign proved generally ineffective, as there was punishment for failure but no particular reward to anyone for success. Prince Nagaya thus decided to change to more of a good cop approach, and this time, in 723, the central government issued the Sanzei Shin no Ho, a law which would permit farmers to possess any land which they had personally developed for cultivation for 3 generations before returning it to the central government. Remember, prior to this, farmland was not an inheritable possession. It was the property of the emperor and the state, lent to the people who farmed it and then returned and redistributed when those people died. With the issuing of the Sanzei Shin no Ho, farmers found themselves with a new motivation to begin working towards the government's goals, as they suddenly had the chance to have some semblance of legal ownership over their own fields. Sadly for the central government, this very law would also be the first loose thread in the unraveling of Japan's new governmental system. The next year, Emperor Monmu's son at last ascended to the chrysanthemum throne at age 23 as Emperor Shomu, although his retiring aunt, Empress Gensho, would continue to participate in court affairs by aiding and advising the young man. Emperor Shomu, whose mother was Fujiwara no Fushito's daughter Miyako, was the first ruler of Fujiwara blood to sit on the imperial throne, and his Fujiwara relatives had every intention of taking advantage of that convenient fact. Active in court politics at this time were the late Fushito's 4 sons, Fujiwara no Muchimaro, Fujiwara no Fusataki, Fujiwara no Umakai, and Fujiwara no Maro, often just referred to as the 4 Fujiwara brothers. With their nephew's enthronement, supreme power was nearly within the brothers' reach, but they still had one very large obstacle standing in their way: Prince Nagaya. In 729, the brothers conspired to frame Nagaya for treason, and they forced him to commit suicide in an incident somewhat bluntly titled the Prince Nagaya Incident, or Nagaya-o no Hen. With the prince out of the way, the brothers then moved to have their younger sister, Komyoshi, married to Emperor Shomu, but not as one of his lesser wives. Komyoshi would become the young emperor's Kogo, his empress consort, his main #1 wife, if you will, a position heretofore reserved only for women of imperial blood. Prince Nagaya certainly would have opposed such a marriage had he been alive, and this was likely a large motivator for his elimination. With their rival dead and their sister made empress consort of Japan, the Fujiwara brothers were on top of the political world, but their golden age would not last long. 8 years after the Prince Nagaya incident, a smallpox plague ravaged the Japanese archipelago, and all 4 brothers perished from the disease in the same year. It is said that many people at the time considered the brothers' untimely demise to be the work of Prince Nagaya's angry spirit, but I will leave it to you to reach your own final conclusions on that one. And with that bit of ghostly hearsay, we have reached the end of our first episode on the people and events of the famous Nara period. I'm hoping to conclude this period in the next episode, but considering all the fascinating material that there is to cover, at this point I really don't feel like I can make any promises. Either way, I really do hope you'll join me. Stay tuned until the end of this outro if you'd like to see a Japanese mnemonic for remembering the date of the capital transfer to Nara. And as always, thanks for watching, have a great day, and...